3 years ago, a stranger handed you a $50 bill and told you to keep the change. You still remember it because of how he did it, folded, pressed into your palm like it was a secret, glancing around first to see who was watching. It wasn't the amount that stuck with you. It was the way he moved, like the money itself was something to be careful with, something that could give him away if the wrong person saw it change hands. You didn't know his name yet. You knew his car, his address, the gate code to his building. You were his driver for 11 months before you ever saw him pay for anything with a card. 11 months of pickups and drop-offs, of holding doors and waiting in parking garages, before you noticed the pattern that would eventually change the way you thought about money for the rest of your life. Everyone in that neighborhood paid with cards. Every restaurant host, every valet, every barista at the coffee shop on the corner expected a tap, not a fold of bills. Everyone except him. You used to think that made him old-fashioned. Maybe careful. Maybe just someone who liked the feel of paper money in his hand the way some people like the feel of a good watch or a real leather jacket. A small, private pleasure that had nothing to do with anyone else. You were wrong about all of it. It took a phone call, one you weren't supposed to overhear, for you to understand why a man worth more than the building he lived in almost never let a transaction touch his name. This isn't a video about tipping habits. It's not really about one man or one car or one strange night outside a clinic with the windows cracked. It's about something most people never think to ask, not once in their entire lives. What does it actually cost to be seen spending money? Stick around. The answer isn't what you'd guess. And by the end, you might find yourself looking at your own wallet a little differently, the way you look at a habit you never questioned until someone finally showed you what it was quietly costing you. Let's get into it. His name was Reznik. You never called him that to his face, just sir, the way you called everyone in that building, the way the job trained you to talk to people who own more square footage than your entire hometown. He lived on the top floor, alone except for a housekeeper who came twice a week and never spoke more than a greeting to you in the elevator. You picked him up most mornings around 7. Same spot, same nod, same quiet ride to wherever the day was taking him. He wasn't unfriendly. He just didn't fill silence for the sake of filling it, and after a while, you stopped trying to fill it for him. The overheard call happened on a Tuesday. You were parked outside a private clinic, waiting, windows cracked because the air conditioning in that old SUV never worked, right, no matter how many times you had it looked at. His voice came through clearer than it should have, carried by the kind of quiet that only exists in expensive neighborhoods at 10 in the morning. He was talking about a divorce, a decade old by then, and how his ex-wife's lawyer had spent nearly 2 years trying to prove he was hiding money somewhere she couldn't see. Forensic accountants. Subpoenas. Every account he'd ever opened pulled apart line by line, looking for the gap, the inconsistency, the thing that would let her walk away with more than the settlement already gave her. They went through everything, he said, his voice flat, almost bored, like he was reading a grocery list out loud. Every card statement, every transaction going back years. And they found nothing, because there was nothing to find. It was all right there, in plain sight the whole time. You didn't understand it at first. You'd always assumed cash was the safer option. The thing rich people used when they didn't want anyone tracing their money, the thing you saw in movies, stacks of bills in a briefcase, untraceable and clean. But over the next few weeks, driving him to meetings you weren't allowed inside, waiting outside buildings with no signs on the door, you started noticing something else entirely, something that didn't fit the story you'd grown up believing. Reznik never carried cash. Not once, not in 11 months. Every coffee, every toll, every single dollar that left his hand went through a card, tracked, dated, time-stamped, sitting quietly in a system somewhere, waiting to be checked if anyone ever needed to check it. The people who hide behind cash, he told you once, almost offhand, watching the city go by through the window like the sentence cost him nothing to say, are the ones who eventually have to explain where it came from. Mine already explains itself. I never have to remember a story, because there's no story to remember. There's just a record. You'd always thought going cashless meant giving something up, privacy, control, the quiet ability to disappear when you needed to. You were about to spend the better part of a year learning it was the opposite. For men like Reznik, the paper trail wasn't a risk he was managing. It was the alibi he never had to build. You started paying closer attention after that conversation. Not just to Reznik, to the pattern itself, to the small things you'd been driving past your whole career without really seeing them. There was an incident, maybe 6 weeks later, that made everything click into place. You were driving a different client that week, filling in for a coworker who'd come down with something and needed the week off. This client was younger, newer money, the kind who still enjoyed being seen enjoying it. He carried a money clip everywhere, thick, silver, visible the second he reached into his jacket, and he made a point of pulling it out slowly at valet stands, at bars, in front of anyone who happened to be standing close enough to notice. One night, outside a club downtown, someone bumped into him on purpose. You saw it happen from the driver's seat, parked across the street, waiting the way you always waited. It wasn't the kind of bump that happens by accident in a crowd. It was quick, practiced, over before you'd even processed what you were watching. By the time you got out of the car and made it across the street, the clip was gone. Just gone. No suspect anyone could describe with confidence, no camera angle that caught a clear face, nothing the police could do beyond handing him a report number he'd never bother looking up again. He laughed it off in the back seat on the ride home. Said it wasn't that much money. Said things like that happen in this city. Said it like a man trying to convince himself more than you. But you noticed his hands weren't steady on the door handle when he finally got out, and you noticed he didn't carry the clip again for weeks after that. You thought about Reznik that night, driving home in the quiet, the streetlights sliding across the windshield one after another. He'd told you once, almost in passing, that he hadn't touched a physical wallet in years. Just a single card, replaceable within the hour if it ever vanished, tied to an account a stranger on a sidewalk could never touch no matter how fast their hands were. Cash is a target the moment someone can see it. It has no undo button, no fraud department standing by, no record proving it was ever yours to begin with. Once it leaves your hand the wrong way, it's simply gone, and there's no version of the story where a phone call gets it back for you. For men like Reznik, that wasn't paranoia talking. That was arithmetic, plain and unemotional, the same way he seemed to look at everything else in his life. The real risk, you realized somewhere on that drive home, was never losing the money itself. It was losing something you had no way of replacing with a phone call the next morning. It wasn't until months later that you understood the other side of it, the part that had nothing to do with safety or theft or clips getting lifted off strangers outside nightclubs. Reznik was buying a building that spring. You didn't know the details, only that it took weeks of meetings, most of them in rooms you never once got to enter. One afternoon, waiting in the lobby of a bank downtown, cooling your heels near a wall of framed photographs nobody ever looked at, you overheard two men in suits talking near the elevators while they waited for him to come down. His file's cleaner than anyone we've underwritten this year, one of them said, not bothering to lower his voice much. Every transaction accounted for, no gaps anywhere. Makes the whole approval process move twice as fast as it normally would. You didn't think much of it in the moment. But later that day, driving him home through slow traffic, Reznik brought it up himself, almost like he already knew you'd overheard every word of it. You know why that loan took 3 weeks instead of 3 months? He said, looking out the window, not really talking to you so much as thinking out loud the way he sometimes did on longer drives. Because there was nothing left to question. Every dollar I've spent for the last decade has a timestamp attached to it somewhere. A bank doesn't have to trust me. They just have to look. He thought about the guy with the money clip, how his entire identity in that world seemed to run on other people believing he had money. The clip, the watch, the loud way he ordered drinks at the bar. Belief that could be bumped into on a sidewalk and taken from him in 4 seconds flat, gone before he even understood what had happened. Reznik didn't need anyone to believe him. He had a record instead, a boring, unremarkable, fully documented trail of a life that never once had to raise its voice to prove it was real. Nobody had to take his word for anything. The paperwork already said it for him. That was the part that finally sat right with you, somewhere around month 8 of driving him. Being seen as rich took performance, effort, a kind of constant maintenance. Being provably reliable took nothing but time and a habit most people never think twice about building. Cash asked the people around you to trust you. The absence of it meant Reznik never had to ask anyone for anything at all. You started testing it on yourself after that, in small, quiet ways he never knew about. You didn't have Reznik's money. Not even close, and you probably never would. But you had a debit card sitting in your wallet next to a habit you'd never once questioned. Pulling out a 20 here, a 40 there, always in cash, always gone by the end of the week without a single memory of where any of it had actually gone. You tried something different one month. Everything through the card. No cash pulled out at all. Not for coffee, not for gas, not for the little things you used to grab without thinking. It felt uncomfortable at first, almost exposed, like someone could suddenly see you spending in a way they hadn't been able to before. But by the 3rd week, something strange started happening. You began noticing the $7 coffees stacking up. The subscription you'd forgotten you were still paying for. The habit of stopping at the gas station not for gas at all, but just for something small to hold on the walk back to the car. Cash had been invisible to you your entire life. Not because it disappeared into thin air, but because it never asked to be remembered. It left your hand and the story simply ended right there. No app pinging you at the end of the month. No number sitting in front of you, plain and undeniable, telling you exactly where $1,200 had quietly gone without ever asking your permission first. You mentioned this to Reznik once, in passing, expecting him to shrug it off the way he shrugged off most small talk. He didn't. That's the actual reason, he said, and for once there was something almost warm in the way he said it, like he was handing you something he didn't often bother explaining to people. Not the safety. Not the paperwork. It's that cash lets you lie to yourself about where it went. A card won't let you do that. It remembers everything, whether you want it to or not. You sat with that longer than you expected to, driving home that night with the radio off. All those months, you'd assumed this whole thing was about hiding money from other people. Lawyers, thieves, banks, anyone who might come looking. It had never once occurred to you that the harder person to hide money from was the one actually holding it. The last piece came from someone who wasn't Reznik at all. You picked up a new client that spring, a woman named Pharaoh, referred by one of Reznik's associates through the kind of quiet introduction that came with no explanation attached and no questions allowed. She ran a small investment fund, the sort that never advertised, never had a website with her photo anywhere on it. You drove her twice a month, always to the same handful of buildings, always the same routine. Card tapped, no cash exchanged, almost no conversation about money at all in the back seat. One ride, stuck in traffic near the financial district, she mentioned, almost as a throwaway line while checking something on her phone, that she'd once had a business partner who did the opposite of everything she did. Cash tips, cash bar tabs, cash pulled out everywhere they went, always loud about it, always making sure the whole room noticed the moment it happened. Within 2 years, that partner had investors pulling out of the fund quietly, one after another, without ever saying exactly why out loud. People don't trust what they can't verify, Pharaoh said, still looking out the window, her voice as flat and certain as Reznik's had been that first Tuesday outside the clinic. It's not that cash means something's wrong. It's that it means nothing about it can actually be checked. And once people can't check something for themselves, they tend to assume the worst version of it anyway, whether that's fair or not. You thought about the guy at the club again, the one with the money clip, how everyone in that bar had believed, for one loud, glittering night, that he was the richest man in the room. And how none of it had mattered 6 weeks later. Once the whole story had shrunk down into a robbery report nobody ever bothered filing a follow-up on. Reznik's card, Pharaoh's card. Boring, quiet, easily forgettable in the moment they were used. But it was the thing that outlasted every conversation ever had about either of them. Not because it was flashy or memorable. Because it never once gave anyone a reason to whisper about them afterward. That was the piece you hadn't fully understood until right then. Sitting in traffic with Pharaoh's voice still hanging in the car. Cash bought you a moment, one loud, visible moment that people remembered for exactly as long as it took to forget. The absence of it bought something that lasted far longer than any single night out ever could. A reputation that never once needed defending. There's one more thing that happened before all of this fully settled into place for you. Something small you almost forgot about until much later, when you finally sat down and tried to make sense of the whole year. It was late summer, maybe 2 weeks after that conversation with Pharaoh in the car. Reznik asked you to stop at a small hardware store on the edge of town. The kind of place with a hand-painted sign and a bell over the door instead of a chime. He needed a single item for a leaking faucet in the guest bathroom. Nothing important enough to send anyone else to handle. You waited outside with the engine running and watched through the window as he stood at the counter with an old man who clearly owned the place. No small talk, no name recognition, nothing that suggested either of them knew who Reznik actually was outside those four walls. He picked up a small part, maybe $11 worth, and reached for his card the same way he always did, out of pure habit, without even glancing at it first. The old man behind the counter mentioned, almost apologetically, that the card reader had been down all morning, some issue with the phone line, and he could only take cash until it got fixed. You watched Reznik pause. Actually pause, for the first time you'd ever seen, patting down pockets that hadn't held a bill in years. He didn't have it. $11. And for a second, standing in a hardware store with a broken card reader. One of the wealthiest men you'd ever driven for didn't have a way to pay for anything at all. He laughed about it walking back to the car, shaking his head at himself. Told you it was the first time in maybe 5 years he'd felt that particular kind of stuck, and that it had taken exactly one broken card reader in a hardware store to remind him what it used to feel like before all of this became automatic. You lent him a 10 and a 1 from your own wallet, cash you happened to have from a tip the night before, and he paid you back within the hour through an app, instantly, the way he did everything else. You thought about that moment for a long time afterward. Not because it proved him wrong. If anything, it proved the opposite. The whole system he'd built around himself had exactly one blind spot, one narrow edge case where the old world and the new one didn't quite line up. And even then, the fix took him about 4 seconds and a phone already in his pocket. That was the actual difference between the two kinds of rich you'd been driving around all those months. Not that one of them never needed help while the other flashed a clip to prove he didn't. It was that one of them could recover from the rare moment things went sideways without it costing him anything real, while the other had built his entire identity around a stack of paper that a single bump on a sidewalk could take from him in 4 seconds flat. Gone for good. No reader to fix, no app to refund it. That hardware store stayed with you longer than almost anything else that year, longer even than the overheard phone call. Because it was the one moment you watched the illusion of total control crack, just slightly, just long enough to remind you that none of this was really about being untouchable. It was about how quickly you could stand back up when something small knocked you off balance for a second. You still drive that same black SUV today. Still wait outside the same kinds of buildings, watching the same kinds of people walk in and out of rooms you'll probably never see the inside of. But you carry your own wallet differently now than you did 3 years ago. Not because you suddenly have Reznik's money. You don't, and you probably never will, not in this lifetime. But because somewhere in those months of quietly watching him live his life, you stopped thinking about cash as freedom and started seeing it for what it actually was in your own hands. A slow, steady way of losing track of yourself, $20 at a time, week after week, without ever once noticing it happening. You think about that money clip sometimes, and the man who used to carry it, and how confident he looked pulling it out at every valet stand he ever stood at. You wonder if he ever figured out what Reznik seemed to already know without anyone having to explain it to him. That being seen as rich and being trusted as reliable were two entirely different things, and only one of them actually held up the moment something went wrong. Reznik never explained himself to anyone. Not once in all the months you drove him. He never had to. His whole life was already written down somewhere, time-stamped, boring enough on paper that nobody ever thought to ask him a second question about any of it. You're not there yet. Maybe you never fully will be. But the next time a 20 leaves your hand for a reason you can't quite name a week later, you think about that lobby, those two men standing by the elevator, and the one sentence that stuck with you longer than almost anything else you heard that entire year. A bank doesn't have to trust me. They just have to look. You close your wallet at the end of the night. Not because it's empty. Because for the first time in longer than you can remember, you actually know exactly where everything in it went.